She thought it was nothing, just a broken-down cabin from a distant aunt she barely remembered. But when Lena Cartwright, a single mom barely scraping by, turned the old key and stepped inside, the silence felt staged. Hidden beneath warped floorboards and behind a false wall, she uncovered a journal wrapped in oilcloth and a stash of gold coins stamped with a Confederate general's insignia, untouched since the Civil War. But this wasn't treasure for the taking. It was tied to secrets powerful men never wanted found. By the time the sun set, she wasn't just a mother trying to make ends meet. She was the keeper of a truth worth killing for. Stick with me. What happens next will blow the lid off everything you thought you knew about American history. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from. If this hits home, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's piece of the puzzle is even bigger. One click helps us bring more of these true-to-life inspirations into the world, and we're so grateful to have you with us. Now, let's begin. The letter didn't come with flowers or sympathy. No call, no warm condolences, just a plain envelope with her name on it, postmarked from a town she barely remembered passing through as a kid. Lena Cartwright stood in the cramped back office of Sally's diner, hands still smelling faintly of burnt coffee and fryer grease, staring at the letter like it might explode. Her boss, Sal, had just finished yelling about another table walking out without tipping when she opened it. The letter was short, legal, cold. You have been named the sole beneficiary of the estate of Marlene Prescott, located in Ashe County, North Carolina. Marlene Prescott. The name didn't ring a bell. Maybe some great aunt her mama never spoke kindly of, if at all, but the rest of the letter held her attention like a hook in the ribs. A cabin, in the mountains, inherited. No strings attached, except the fact that she was out of rent money, her car barely ran, and her manager had just told her not to bother coming back after this weekend. Lena folded the letter slowly, her fingers trembling. Outside the diner, a steady drizzle tapped at the windows, making the world look blurry and far away. Her 10-year-old son, Wyatt, sat in the booth closest to the heater, nose buried in a tattered book about the Civil War. His shoelaces were untied again. His jacket had a hole in the elbow she kept meaning to fix. Charlotte wasn't working anymore, not for them. She sat across from him and placed the letter on the table. "Pack your things, baby," she said softly. "We're going to the mountains." The road into Ashe County twisted like a question nobody had a good answer to. The farther they drove, the less cell service they had, and by the time they reached the narrow gravel path leading up into the woods, the car was sputtering like a man with a dying secret. Wyatt stared out the passenger window in awe. "This is like where ghosts would live." Lena glanced at him. "You scared?" He shrugged. "A little, but it's cool." The cabin stood at the top of the ridge, half swallowed by trees thick with ice and silence. It leaned a little to the left, its porch sagging like a tired spine, but the structure held. Smoke hadn't graced its chimney in years. The snow crunched under their boots as they stepped out into a world that felt 100 years removed from anything modern. Lena unlocked the front door with the old brass key from the envelope. It stuck halfway in, then turned with a long, groaning protest. Inside, the air smelled like cedar and secrets. The floorboards creaked beneath their steps, echoing into rooms cloaked in dust. Cobwebs curled in the corners like forgotten thoughts. The fireplace was stone, wide and empty. An old oil lamp sat on the mantel beside a cracked photograph of a woman in 1940s clothing, stern, unsmiling. Wyatt ran his hand along a shelf filled with yellowing books and stopped. "What's that?" Lena followed his gaze to the far wall, where a framed document hung. The ink was faded, but she could make out a seal at the top. It was a deed. Prescott Cabin and Grounds, containing legacy as sealed. Legacy. The word hung in her head like a bell. She turned to Wyatt. "Guess this place has stories." He nodded, his breath misting in the cold. "I hope one of them's about treasure." They spent the night sleeping in their clothes, wrapped in donated quilts, curled up in the only bedroom with insulation that didn't make the wind whistle through the walls. The old cast-iron stove groaned like a bear every time it heated up, but it worked. Outside, the wind whispered through trees and across the roof, like someone looking for a way in. The next morning, Lena walked into town, if you could call it that. 3 storefronts, 1 gas station, a faded barbershop, and a single stop sign. She found the courthouse on the hill next to the library. Inside, she asked about her aunt. The clerk raised an eyebrow. Marlene? She passed months back. No family came round. You her girl? Apparently. She left you the cabin? He leaned back, rubbing the stubble on his chin. Well, folks say that land's got history, the kind that don't rest easy. Lena didn't reply. She took her file copies, nodded politely, and left. By the end of that week, they'd swept, dusted, fixed the broken porch step, and plugged the worst of the drafts with old quilts and newspaper. Wyatt had taken to calling the cabin Fort Boone, referencing some battle she didn't remember from school. Every evening, he sketched by the fireplace, using charcoal he found in the old wood box. He asked her that Thursday, while drawing with his tongue poking from the corner of his mouth, "Do you think ghosts can get bored?" Lena looked up from the soup she was stirring. Why? Because if I was a ghost, I'd want to watch somebody do something interesting, not just sit around hiding forever. She paused. Well, I guess that depends on what kind of secrets a place is keeping. He looked at her then, wide-eyed. You think this cabin has secrets? She didn't answer, because she didn't know yet. But the way the wind curled under the doors, the way the fireplace always seemed just slightly warmer on one side, the way the floor groaned louder at midnight than at noon, something was waiting. On Friday night, just after midnight, a noise pulled her awake, not wind, not settling wood. Something behind the fireplace. It was subtle, like a dragging sound, a whisper of movement from behind the stone. Lena sat up in bed, holding her breath. Wyatt stirred beside her, then settled again. She stepped into the living room, the cold air biting at her arms. The fire had gone out, and yet, in the faint moonlight slanting through the crooked windows, she could swear she saw something shift in the shadows beyond the hearth. She stared at the fireplace for a long time, the air thick and still. Then, just before turning away, she noticed it. A line of soot on the floor, shaped like a boot print, one step, then nothing. Lena stood frozen, heart hammering. Whatever this place was, it wasn't done telling its story yet. The wind had a strange way of talking in the mountains, never a scream, for a whisper. It moaned low, like something buried deep, pushing its voice through the cracks in old boards and stone chimneys. Lena heard it again that morning, just after sunrise. She poured hot water over stale instant coffee, leaned against the warped countertop of the cabin's kitchen. She hadn't slept much. The memory of that lone soot print on the hearth's stone floor kept playing in her mind like a record with a scratch. The print had been gone by morning. No smudge, no trace, like it had never been there. And yet, she knew what she saw. Wyatt sat cross-legged on the floor in the living room, surrounded by books they pulled from a built-in shelf tucked into the hallway wall. Most were unreadable, faded beyond recognition, their pages swollen from decades of damp mountain air. But a few had legible spines, titles like Tales of the Blue Ridge, Boone's Lost Regiment, and a dusty, unmarked black journal that Wyatt hadn't dared to open yet. "Hey, Mom," he said without looking up. "Did you know there were battles fought all through these hills? Not like big ones, little ones. Ambushes, escape routes, hidden camps." She stirred her coffee. "Makes sense. All this forest and nowhere to run but deeper in." "There's stories," he continued, flipping a page with his sleeve-covered hand. "Some Confederates hid gold, like real treasure. Some of it still ain't found." Lena snorted. "Probably in the same place as Bigfoot and Elvis." But Wyatt didn't laugh. He was focused now, peering closely at a wrinkled page tucked into one of the books like a forgotten receipt. He pulled it out gently. It was brittle and yellowed, folded 3 times. "Mom, look." She walked over and took it from his hands. The paper was a map, hand-drawn, the ink faded, but clear enough to trace with a finger. The landmarks were strange. No road names, just trees, a river bend, and a small X marked right where the chimney of the cabin would be, right beneath the fireplace. "Maybe it's just a drawing," she said carefully. Wyatt grinned. "Or maybe it's not." They started in the living room, moving the rug, then the heavy rocker, and finally the iron fire grate. The hearthstone was cool, smudged with ash and time. Lena knelt and ran her hands along the edges of each stone, each unmoving, until she knocked on one just to the left of center, hollow. She looked up at Wyatt. He was holding his breath. "Get me a flashlight." Minutes later, with a screwdriver and a crowbar borrowed from the barn out back, Lena pried loose the stone. It came free with a groan and a puff of soot. Inside the narrow cavity was a wooden box, blackened with age. She slid it out gently. The box was no bigger than a shoebox, bound with an old, rusted latch. Lena hesitated for a long second before snapping it open. Inside, a revolver. Heavy, rusted, its grip cracked from years of moisture. A tarnished Confederate pin. A small, cracked leather pouch holding half-rotted paper bills. And beneath them all, folded tightly and sealed with wax, was a map. Not a copy. Not a children's pirate map. A real one. Thick parchment. And in the corner, faded but still legible, were the initials GTB. Wyatt stared. "Mom, what's GTB?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't know. Yet." Later that afternoon, they drove back into town. Lena had found an excuse to meet someone, anyone, who might know something. She left Wyatt at the diner with a grilled cheese and one of the books, and made her way across the square to the smallest building on Main Street, the Historical Society. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The air smelled like old paper and linseed oil. Behind the counter sat a thin man with a gray beard and even grayer ponytail. He looked up from a leather-bound ledger and squinted. "You're not local," he said, not unkindly. "Just moved in," Lena replied. "Cartwright. I inherited the Prescott place." The man raised an eyebrow. "That old cabin still standing?" "Barely. You Eli Potts?" "Depends. You with the county?" She smiled. "Nope. Just curious." He leaned back in his chair. "Then I'm Eli." Lena pulled the folded map from her coat and slid it across the counter. Eli stared at it a long time. He didn't touch it, not at first. "That's not something most folks would show around here." "Why's that?" He leaned in close, voice lower now. "Because it looks a lot like the old Boone Trail maps, and anything tied to General Thaddeus Boone tends to stir up more trouble than treasure." Lena frowned. "Boone? As in the Confederate general?" "Legend says he disappeared somewhere around these hills with half a regiment and a chest full of stolen gold. Never seen again. But that seal..." Eli tapped the corner of the map, just above the initials. "That's his." "So what do I do with it?" He gave her a look that was half concern, half warning. "You be real careful. That cabin don't forget." That night, snow started falling again. Wyatt sat on the floor, the revolver cleaned and displayed on an old cloth. He wasn't touching it, just studying it like an artifact in a museum. The Confederate pin lay beside it, its edges dulled by time. The map had been refolded, carefully placed back in the box. Lena stared into the fire, a headache pressing against her temples. She felt a weight pressing in, the kind that didn't come from ghosts or gold, but from choices. She could leave now, sell the land, take doors off her and be done. But what if there really was something here, something meant to be found, but only by someone who needed it enough to look beneath the dust? At 2:17 a.m., the noise came again, behind the fireplace. This time, Wyatt heard it too. He shuffled into the room in his socks, eyes wide and glassy. "Did you hear that?" Lena nodded. They stood together in silence, staring at the stonework. Then came the sound, a shuffle, a scrape, then silence. Lena stepped forward and placed her palm on the stone. It was cold, solid, and yet she could feel something, like the echo of a heartbeat on the other side. She looked at her son and said, more to herself than to him, "This place is remembering." The morning after the noise behind the fireplace, the air inside the cabin felt heavier, like the walls were listening. Lena had always thought silence was peace. But here, in this old structure steeped in forgotten stories and mountain frost, silence meant something else. It meant waiting. Wyatt barely touched his oatmeal. His usual stream of trivia was replaced by quiet scribbling in his notebook, a crude sketch of the revolver the Confederate pin, and that strange map with its faded X beneath the chimney. "You think it's real?" he finally asked. Lena looked up from the pot of coffee she'd reheated 3 times. "What's real?" "The gold, the story, that someone like General Boone actually hid treasure under this house." She smiled faintly. "I think it's easier to believe in legends when you've got cold feet and nothing in your wallet." He frowned. "So, we're not going to look for it?" She didn't answer, because the truth was, she wasn't sure if this was adventure or madness. But something in her gut said, keep digging. After breakfast, Lena pushed up her sleeves and returned to the fireplace, determined to see if the sound had come from within the structure. She ran her fingers along the stone again, this time checking for seams, edges, inconsistencies. She tapped it gently with the base of a screwdriver, listening for that hollow tone. And there it was, a stone slightly darker than the rest, a bit loose. "Wyatt," she called, "bring me the pry bar." With the same delicate patience she once used to help her husband roll over in the final days of his illness, Lena wedged the tool behind the stone and eased it free. A thin gust of air rushed out, cool and stale, like exhaled breath from something long buried. Inside was a small cavity, and within it, a pouch. Leather, cracked and stiff from decades of hiding. She pulled it out slowly, heart hammering. She opened it over the coffee table. A few damp, crumbling paper bills fell out, marked with Confederate script. And then a coin, no, a medallion. Brass, stained with green and black oxidation, but still bearing a clear engraving, GTB. Lena turned it over. On the back, an etching, "To never yield, Boone." Her heart stilled for a second. Wyatt whispered, "General Thaddeus Boone." The name hung in the room like smoke. Later that day, Lena and Wyatt headed back into town with the medallion and the pouch. Lena knew she couldn't trust just anyone with this information, but one person had already proved he knew more than he let on. Eli Potts. The Historical Society was dimly lit when they arrived, the dust motes dancing like lazy spirits in the air. Eli sat at his usual desk, sorting through a stack of faded maps. He looked up and raised an eyebrow. "You bring me trouble?" he asked, though his voice was more amused than accusatory. "Maybe," Lena replied. She laid the pouch on the counter and let him examine the contents. Eli picked up the medallion carefully, holding it to the light. He squinted, turning it over slowly. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Haven't seen one of these since '79. Thought it was a myth." "You mean this confirms it?" He nodded. "That's Boone's medallion, all right, issued to his inner circle, men who followed him when he split from command near the end of the war." Wyatt leaned in. "So he did disappear with gold?" "Legend says he took a full wagon load of Confederate currency, melted coins, even Union spoils, headed west into these mountains with a dozen loyal men, and was never seen again." "What happened to them?" Lena asked. Eli sighed. "Depends who you ask. Some say they starved. Others say they killed each other off. Most agree Boone made it to a cabin somewhere, hid the gold, and left instructions for someone to finish what he started." "Finish what?" Lena asked, her voice low. "The South rising again," Eli said, almost spitting the words like they tasted bitter. "Boone wasn't just hiding treasure. He was preserving hate." Wyatt sat back, eyes wide. Lena took a breath. "So, if we found this, what does that mean?" Eli looked at her, eyes serious now. "It means you're in the middle of something that still matters to some folks, people who don't care if the war's over." When they returned to the cabin, Sheriff Annie Morales' cruiser was parked out front. Lena bristled, not because she didn't trust Annie, they'd grown up together, but because she'd hoped to keep things quiet. Annie stood on the porch, arms folded. "Word travels fast out here," she said as Lena and Wyatt approached. "We didn't tell anyone," Lena replied. Annie nodded toward the mountains. "Didn't have to. Clayton Doerr's been sniffing around. Filed a permit with the county to run a geological survey on your land." "For what?" "He says the soil's valuable. Claims he's interested in conservation, but I know that man. He smells money." Lena frowned. "He ever mentioned gold?" "Number?" But he did ask if any historical sites had been registered on your property. That set Lena's nerves on fire. She thought of the map, the medallion, the noise behind the fireplace. You need to be careful, Len, Annie said, voice softer now. Folks around here don't always play nice when money's involved, especially old money. Lena looked toward the cabin, where Wyatt stood watching from the window. We're not leaving, she said. Not until I know what's under this place. That night, as snow fell again, and the sky turned the color of bruised steel, Wyatt stayed up late. He sat on the floor beside the fire, tracing lines on the map with a pencil and ruler, cross-referencing trees and ridgelines with old books Eli had given him. He turned one book sideways and grinned. Mom, he said, look. Lena leaned over. Wyatt had traced a line from the X on the map beneath the chimney to a series of tiny markings that looked like nothing, until you flipped the page. It lines up, he said, from the hearth, down, like a tunnel. Lena blinked. A tunnel? Under the cabin? Maybe a root cellar, or something deeper. Just then, the fire popped loudly, sending a scatter of sparks into the stone. Lena's hand instinctively went to the floor. Something about the way the heat gathered along the left wall felt wrong, warmer than it should be. She pressed her palm flat. There was air moving, behind stone. Again, and somewhere out beyond the tree line, in the cold Appalachian dark, a set of eyes watched the flickering cabin light through binoculars. Not Dorr, not Eli, not even the sheriff. Someone else. Someone whose family had been waiting for this map to resurface for over 100 years, and now the pieces were falling into place. The morning sun barely cracked through the thick Appalachian cloud cover, casting a pale light across the cabin's frost-draped windows. Lena stood at the sink, watching steam curl up from her coffee as a growing unease coiled deep in her stomach. Wyatt was still asleep, curled in his sleeping bag by the fireplace, and the world outside looked peaceful enough. But something had shifted. The discovery behind the hearth, the medallion, the whispers about General Boone. It all felt like the first page of a book you can't close once opened. And now there was Clayton Dorr, a real estate developer with too much charm and not enough soul. Dorr had shown up yesterday with a polished truck, a designer jacket too clean for dirt roads, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That afternoon, Lena drove into town again, this time alone. She needed work, anything. The cabin might be paid for, but they still needed food, gas, school supplies, winter coats. She stopped by the Hitching Post Cafe, hoping someone had quit or been fired. No luck. Same with the general store and the feed shop. At the town hall, she found Clayton Dorr standing at the counter with a man in a crisp suit, laughing too loud. When he saw her, the laughter stopped, and he turned like he'd been expecting her. Ms. Cartwright, he said smoothly, tipping an invisible hat. I've been hoping we'd get a chance to talk properly. She gave a polite nod. I'm just here to check on job postings. Of course, of course. He gestured toward the bulletin board. But since you're here, maybe we could step outside. Won't take but a minute. Lena hesitated, then followed him out into the chill. Clayton leaned on the rail of the porch, scanning the tree line like he was buying up the horizon. Beautiful land you've got out there, he said. Prime spot, isolated, untouched. People pay big money for that kind of silence. I'm not selling. He smiled again, that same half smile that said he didn't believe you the first time. Of course, but think about it, all right? I represent folks who are very interested in acquiring property with historic value. We'd preserve the land, build a lodge, maybe a heritage site, make sure no one ruins the legacy. What legacy? Oh, you know, the rumors, the gold, the Boone connection. He tilted his head. People talk, and I like to listen. Lena stared at him. So you know about the map. He didn't flinch. I know enough to know that kind of thing draws attention, the good kind and the bad. Lena's fists clenched at her sides. Clayton took a step closer. Here's my card. If things get complicated, I can make them go away. Money smooths a lot of bumps, Lena. She didn't take the card. Careful, she said quietly. Some bumps have roots. Back at the cabin, Wyatt was kneeling on the floor near the hearth, eyes locked on a ciphered page they'd found tucked behind the Confederate medallion. The page was brittle, covered in handwritten code, rows of letters and symbols that looked like nonsense. Whoever wrote this didn't want anyone else reading it, he muttered. Maybe not even themselves, Lena said, shrugging off her jacket. I think it's a substitution cipher, Wyatt continued, like how the Confederates sent secret messages during the war. Eli gave me a key to try. Lena crouched beside him, eyeing the page. Any luck? I cracked 2 lines so far, he said proudly. It says something like, where Boone's promise rests, the faithful shall kneel. And then, the blade guards the heart. Lena frowned. That's not just a map, that's a warning. Before they could dig further, there was a knock at the door. They both froze. It was Sheriff Morales. Lena opened the door, and Annie stepped inside, brushing snow from her boots. You get a visit from Dorr yet? She asked. Just this morning. Annie nodded. He filed an environmental review request. Says there's old waste on the property that needs assessing. Could stall you for months. Lena's jaw tightened. Why would he do that unless he wants us off that land? Annie shrugged. Because he knows you're not just squatting on an old cabin. He knows something's under it, something valuable. Lena turned away, staring at the fire. He said he'd make the complications go away, for a price. You thinking of taking it? I don't want to, she sighed. But Wyatt and I can't live off history, or ghosts. Annie stepped closer. Look, I'm your friend, but I'm also the law here. If you find something big, gold, relics, bodies, you need to report it. Don't let that boy get hurt chasing ghost stories. Lena met her eyes. He's not chasing anything. He's uncovering it. Later that night, while Lena slept restlessly, Wyatt stayed up, eyes flicking between the ciphered letter and his history book. He scribbled notes, tried combinations, circled repeated symbols. Then he stopped. One line repeated 3 times in different places. The words were clearer now. The heart of Boone lies beneath the blade. He looked at the fireplace again. No, not the fireplace. The stone hearth had a seam, not where they'd found the pouch, but beneath a narrow slit just beside the fire grate. He crawled closer, tapping the floor gently. The sound changed, a hollow pocket. He grabbed the flashlight, pried gently with a ruler. The slab shifted slightly, just a hair, enough to let out a puff of air. He didn't lift it. Instead, he whispered, Mom, wake up. Lena was instantly alert, instincts sharpened by years of night shifts and too many bad dreams. She followed Wyatt into the living room. He pointed wordlessly at the hearth. She knelt down and put her hand to the edge of the stone. Cold, but it moved. Together, they lifted. Inside was a narrow shaft, brick-lined, maybe 5 feet deep. A small set of wooden rungs led downward. Lena shone the flashlight in and caught her breath. At the bottom, a dirt floor, a canvas sack, and the faint glint of iron. They exchanged a look. Do we go down? Wyatt whispered. Lena swallowed. Not yet. We wait for daylight. But as they stood there, the wind outside shifted again. A soft thud came from the porch, then another. Lena crossed to the window, pulled back the curtain, boot prints, fresh ones. Leading to the door, then around the house. She flicked off the porch light. No sound, no knock, just silence. That kind of silence that listens. She stepped back and locked the door. Outside, hidden just beyond the tree line, a figure stood watching. Silas Boone, broad-shouldered, unshaven, and wrapped in a tattered coat. He knelt in the snow and pressed one hand into the earth. He smiled. The promise is waking up. The thaw came early that year. Winter hadn't quite finished its sentence, but spring had already begun to whisper. For days, the snow melted in slow streams along the ridgelines, pooling at the base of the trees and softening the dirt paths that twisted down from the mountains. In the mornings, a mist hung low across the fields, like breath from the earth itself, heavy and waiting. Lena stood on the cabin porch with her hands in her coat pockets, watching steam rise from her coffee. The woods were quiet, but not calm. The ground had shifted. She could feel it, not just in the soil beneath her boots, but in the air, in the way the birds refused to land too close to the cabin. Even the wind carried something uneasy. Wyatt came out behind her, rubbing his eyes. "I had the dream again," he said, voice still hoarse from sleep. Lena glanced at him. "Same one?" He nodded. "The tunnel, the echo, but this time I saw someone. A man in a uniform. He was digging fast, like he didn't have much time." She didn't ask if he was scared. Wyatt wasn't the kind of boy to admit it, even when his hands trembled. Instead, she said, "We'll check the cellar again today, carefully." They waited until the fog cleared before making their way around the side of the cabin. The entrance to the root cellar was partially hidden behind a collapsed lean-to, buried under half-frozen brush. Lena kicked aside loose branches, then yanked on the rusted handle until the door groaned open like something being disturbed after a long sleep. The stairs down were slick and cracked, but intact. They moved slow, flashlight beams cutting through the musty dark. The walls were brick, original, likely Civil War era, and built to last. They passed the shelves of crumbling jars and the rusted hooks that once held winter meat, stepping over old sacks of grain, hardened to rock. Then Lena saw it. The ground had sunk along the back wall, just left of the wooden shelves. Not dramatically, but enough that the soil had caved in, leaving a shallow depression. She knelt down and pressed her hand into the dirt. Software damp, and underneath, wood? She brushed it clean, not floorboards, planks, laid in a square, a hatch. Wyatt crouched beside her. "That wasn't here before, right?" Lena shook her head. "Not exposed anyway. That thaw did more than melt snow." Together they cleared the soil until the planks were fully uncovered. A rusted iron loop stuck up from the center. Lena hesitated. Then she gripped it, braced her boots, and pulled. The hatch opened with a groan and a waft of air that smelled like rot, mold, and something else. Something old. She gagged, blinking into the hole. Below was a chamber, maybe 5 feet down, with brick walls and a dirt floor. A ladder leaned against the edge, ancient, brittle. "Don't move too fast," she told Wyatt. They descended one at a time, breath visible in the cold. The chamber wasn't big, maybe the size of a small shed, but it was enough to hold the bones. The skeleton was slumped in the far corner, curled as if trying to protect something. Bits of ragged clothing still clung to it. Wool, faded gray, with buttons shaped like stars. Beside it, half buried in the dirt, was a heavy iron strongbox, covered in rust, its edges eaten away by time. Wyatt froze. "Is that—" Lena nodded slowly. "Yeah, it is." She knelt beside the bones, careful not to disturb them. The strongbox was padlocked, the metal so corroded she could flake off rust with her fingernail. There were marks on the inside of the lid, scratches, dozens of them, as if someone trapped inside had clawed at it before finally giving up. Wyatt whispered, "Did he lock himself in?" Lena's stomach turned. Or someone locked him in. They didn't try to open the box, not yet. Instead, Lena called the sheriff. Annie Morales arrived an hour later with her deputy and 2 crime scene bags. She wore her usual uniform, her hair pulled back tight under a brown knit cap. When she saw the chamber, her breath caught. "You were right not to touch anything," she said, crouching beside the skeleton. "What do you think happened?" Lena asked. Annie studied the bones. "Hard to say. Could have been a deserter, or someone trying to protect whatever's in that box." She looked at the hatch. "You said this was sealed?" "Covered with dirt. We didn't even know it was there until the ground shifted." Annie stood and turned to her deputy. "Get this area taped off. No one else goes down there." Lena frowned. "What do you mean? This is my land." "Doesn't matter," Annie said gently. "Now it's a crime scene." "State law." Wyatt's eyes widened. "Are they going to take the box?" Annie looked at him. "They'll examine it, sure. If it's Confederate relics, it might go to the Historical Society. But if it's stolen, or part of a larger investigation, it's ours," Wyatt said firmly. "We found it." Annie's voice softened. "Maybe, but possession's complicated when bones are involved." That night, Lena sat by the fire, staring into the flames. She felt something between betrayal and fear. She hadn't expected the sheriff to shut them out, hadn't expected the legal language. But now the strongbox was gone, tagged, and packed into a police vehicle. And even though no one had opened it yet, Lena had a terrible feeling. Wyatt was quiet, curled up on the couch, with a blanket over his legs. "They're going to take everything," he said quietly. "No," Lena replied. "They're going to try." Around midnight, Lena woke to a flicker of orange outside the window. At first, she thought it was the moonlight catching mist, but then the smell hit. Smoke. She rushed to the front porch, heart slamming. The fire hadn't started at the cabin, but close. A tree on the edge of the clearing was burning, flames licking up its trunk. Too clean, too sudden. No lightning, no accident. "Wyatt!" she shouted. "Get outside!" He appeared, pale and frantic. "Is it the cabin?" "No, just a warning," she muttered. They worked fast, dousing the edge with water from the old hand pump, stomping out embers with wet towels. It took nearly 20 minutes before the fire was out. They stood, panting, staring into the woods. No footsteps, no voices. But someone had come. Someone wanted them scared. The next morning, Lena called Eli. He arrived just before sunrise, bringing with him a small crowbar and a thermos of bitter coffee. She told him everything, about the bones, the strongbox, the fire. Eli listened silently, then nodded. "I warned you," he said. "That land remembers." "You think it was Boone's man?" Lena asked. "The skeleton?" "Could be, or someone who crossed him." Wyatt brought out the cipher again. "We think the page talks about a tunnel beneath the cabin. A place called Boone's Promise. Eli studied it." His eyes darkened. "I've seen that phrase before. Old newspaper clippings, diaries. Boone's Promise wasn't a place. It was a vow, a declaration. He believed the South would rise again, and he was willing to kill anyone to protect the gold that would fund it." Lena looked at him. "What does that mean for us?" Eli exhaled. "It means that Strongbox might just be the beginning." And somewhere down the mountain, in a makeshift trailer, strung with maps and grainy Civil War prints, Silas Boone stared at a black and white photo of the cabin. He ran his thumb over the image and whispered, "I'm coming for it." The frost had melted into mud, and the cabin creaked like it was trying to shrug off winter's weight. Lena hadn't slept more than a few hours in days. Since the fire, she kept the shotgun propped up against the wall beside her bed and checked the windows every few hours like clockwork. But it wasn't just fear that kept her awake. It was the gnawing sense that something ancient had been disturbed and it wasn't going to sleep again. Wyatt, meanwhile, had found a new obsession. The ciphered pages weren't just old writing to him, they were a challenge, a puzzle worth solving. He spread them out across the kitchen table, surrounded by Civil War books, pencils, and scrap paper covered in scribbles. A cheap corkboard leaned against the wall, peppered with theories and hand-drawn maps. Lena poured herself coffee and sat beside him. "You slept?" Wyatt shrugged. "Sort of. My brain won't stop moving." He tapped one of the pages. "I cracked 2 more lines last night. Listen to this. Under hearth and hunger, Boone's vow lies buried. Not gold, but the promise that binds blood." Lena furrowed her brow. "That doesn't sound like treasure. That sounds like a warning." "Or a clue," Wyatt said. "It keeps mentioning Boone's Promise." "What if it's not just a phrase? What if it's a place?" Lena nodded slowly. If Boone built tunnels and hideouts, it'd be like him to name them something dramatic. Eli arrived around noon, carrying an old lantern and a canvas roll of tools. He stepped into the cabin with a shake of his head. "Heard from Morales," he said. "They shipped the strongbox to Raleigh. Some university's historical preservation office. They'll be cataloging it for weeks." "What about the remains?" Lena asked. "Coroner says mid-1800s. Probably male. No ID, obviously. Sheriff's treating it like a closed case unless something new turns up." Lena exhaled. "Convenient." Eli looked at the ciphered letters. "You think this is connected to the cellar?" Wyatt nodded. "Definitely. Look, this section talks about tools, torchlight, and a sealed chamber where Boone's Promise is carved in stone. We think there's another room down there." Lena hesitated. "We can't just break into the cellar again." Eli gave her a look. Sure we can. We own the rest of the foundation. It's our property above the soil. Lena looked from Eli to Wyatt. Then she got up and grabbed her gloves. Let's dig. They returned to the cellar in the late afternoon. The thaw had made everything damp, and the air smelled of mildew and old secrets. Wyatt led the way with a flashlight, careful not to step too close to the place where the strongbox had been unearthed. Eli tapped on the brick wall with a crowbar, pausing when he heard a different pitch. Here, he muttered, this section sounds hollow. Help me with the mortar. They worked in tense silence, chipping away at the bricks. After nearly an hour, a small opening emerged, revealing the edge of a narrow tunnel. Lena aimed the flashlight down it. Jesus, it keeps going. And it looks old, Eli added. Real old, crude stonework, uneven support beams. You don't build something like this unless you want it to last, or hide. They crawled in single file, ducking under low beams. The tunnel sloped downward, then flattened out. At the end, they reached a sealed wooden door. Faded lettering had been burned into the frame. Boone's Promise, Wyatt whispered. Lena reached for the handle, but it didn't turn. Locked, she muttered. Of course it is. Eli examined the metal plate near the knob. It wasn't a standard keyhole. Looks like it needs something else. Wyatt pulled out the Confederate officer's badge they'd found behind the fireplace. This, he said, it fits the shape. He slid the badge into the slot. With a heavy click, the door creaked open. The room beyond was barely taller than Wyatt. It smelled of rust and damp wood. Along the walls were shelves filled with tools, pickaxes, torches, old military supplies. Maps hung on hooks, some faded beyond recognition. A large stone table sat in the middle, carved with the same emblem as the medallion they'd found earlier. And at the far end was a second chest. This one wasn't locked, just heavy. Lena and Eli heaved the lid open. Inside, stacks of gold coins wrapped in leather pouches, a dagger with a bone handle, and a scroll, sealed with wax and stamped with the letters GTB. Eli took a step back. That's it. That's Boone's personal seal. Lena looked at the gold, then at the scroll. Read it, she said. Eli broke the seal and unrolled it. Let the South rise not with shouts, but with silence. Let the blade be buried with the vow. When the time comes, blood will know its way home. They all stared at each other. Wyatt said what they were all thinking. This isn't just treasure, it's a warning. When they returned to the cabin, night had fallen. Snow began to drift again, soft and slow. But just as Lena was locking up for the night, headlights swept across the trees. A truck pulled into the driveway. Clayton Dorr stepped out. This time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Silas Boone, coat dusted with snow, eyes locked on the cabin like he'd found something he'd been hunting for years. Lena barely had time to process what she was seeing. The sight of Silas Boone, solid, sharp-eyed, and standing alongside Clayton Dorr, stole the warmth from the room like a draft from an open grave. She stepped onto the porch, shotgun in hand, not raised, but not hidden either. You're not welcome here, she said, her voice low, clipped. Dorr smiled like a man who always thought the deck was stacked in his favor. Just stopping by. Thought you might reconsider my offer. Silas Boone stood quiet, hands in the pockets of a thick brown coat. His presence was colder than the mountain air. His eyes scanned the cabin, like he knew every nail that had ever been hammered into it. Wyatt came to the door behind her, whispering, "Is that him?" "Back inside," Lena said without looking. Dorr chuckled. "We both know there's more to that cabin than wood and memories. Boone blood built this place. Boone blood's come to collect." Lena felt the weight of the cellar beneath her boots, the gold hidden in the tunnel, the letter sealed with a ghost's threat. "You need to leave now," she said, "before this becomes something else." Silas finally spoke, voice rough and quiet. "This ain't yours. Never was. My great-great-grandfather spilled blood for that treasure. You think some waitress and her boy get to keep it?" Lena tightened her grip on the shotgun. Dorr lifted his hands in mock surrender. "We'll give you time to think," he said, "but don't take too long. Bad things have a habit of happening when folks hold on to things they shouldn't." They drove off, tires spinning through half-melted snow. Lena stood frozen, watching taillights vanish down the mountain road. Her breath fogged in front of her. Behind her, Wyatt said what they both already knew. They're not done. Sheriff Morales arrived the next morning. Lena told her everything. The gold, the cipher, the tunnel, the letter. Everything except one thing. How much they'd found. Annie was furious. You should have called me the second you opened that second chest. You have no idea the legal storm you're standing in. I didn't want this to be about treasure, Lena replied. It's history. Dangerous history. It's evidence, Annie snapped, and you're sitting on enough Civil War contraband to launch an FBI task force. Lena didn't argue, but Wyatt stepped forward, holding the medallion from the first pouch. This doesn't belong in a vault. It belongs to the past. Annie sighed. I'll file an official report, but I'll do what I can to keep this local. For now. She paused. And that man you saw, Boone, if he shows up again, call me first, before you go frontier justice on anybody. Lena nodded, but part of her already knew the next time might not allow that kind of mercy. Eli returned that evening with photocopies of military records. Clayton Doerr's grandfather owned timber all through this valley, he explained. His great-grandfather, Confederate courier, one of Boone's last riders. Wyatt leaned over the table. So Doerr has a connection too? Enough of one to claim legacy, Eli said, but not enough to claim ownership. They opened the scroll again, reading Boone's vow. Let the blade be buried with the vow. When the time comes, blood will know its way home. Lena shivered. He thought this was a cause, not just a cache. Wyatt looked at the gold coins. What do we do with it? Silence. Eli finally said, if we keep it, we become part of the curse. If we give it up, they'll come anyway. But maybe there's another way. They packed the chest, not to run, but to prepare. It started snowing again the next day. Heavy, wet flakes that silenced the woods. Lena felt it before she heard it. The shift in the wind, the hush that came before movement. Then a knock at the cabin door. She opened it slowly. Silas Boone stood there, alone this time, a rifle slung over his shoulder. We end this now, he said. Lena raised the shotgun. You get one warning, she said. He stepped forward. You really think I won't do what has to be done? Behind him, headlights flashed. Sheriff Morales. Her truck skidded to a stop. She jumped out, gun drawn. Drop the weapon, she shouted. Silas hesitated, then turned, and that was his mistake. Lena tackled him, the shotgun clattering to the porch as both went down in the snow. Morales closed the distance fast, cuffs ready. When Silas was in the back of the cruiser, Morales turned to Lena. What did I say? Lena was bleeding from the lip, her knuckles raw. You said call you first. I didn't have time. Later that night, Lena sat in front of the fire, exhausted. Wyatt joined her, holding one of the gold coins. Are we going to jail? She smiled weakly. Number. But we might get famous. Worse, we might get attention. He nodded. So what do we do now? She took the coin and tossed it into the flames. It hissed, then blackened. We bury the past, she said, and we build something better over it. The storm rolled in with eerie silence. No wind, no thunder, just snow, thick and deliberate, cloaking the world in white like a shroud. The roads disappeared under a fresh blanket of powder by dusk, and Lena locked every window and door before the first nightfall flake had fully settled. Wyatt could sense her tension, though she tried to hide it. Is he coming back? He asked, standing at the window, watching flakes swirl in the cabin's weak porch light. I don't know, Lena admitted, but we're ready if he does. She wasn't sure that was true. Eli had promised to check in by radio that night, but static filled the receiver. Morales had driven Silas Boone out of the valley in cuffs, but something about the man's silence, the weight of his name, made Lena feel like he was still breathing through the walls of this place. At midnight, the power cut. Wyatt was the first to notice the glow outside. Not moonlight, not reflection. Fire. Lena pulled back the curtain and froze. A ring of flames burned at the tree line. Torches. Moving. Downstairs, she whispered to Wyatt, grabbing the shotgun and ushering him into the tunnel entrance through the cellar. She had stocked it with water, food, blankets. She hadn't expected to use it this soon. She turned back for her coat when a voice called from outside. "You can't hide the truth forever." It was Silas Boone. Lena felt her chest tighten. How the hell had he gotten out? The cabin windows shattered first, rocked through glass. One, two, then another against the side door. Lena fired a warning shot from the porch, hoping to startle them. It worked for a few seconds. Then came footsteps. Multiple. They were surrounding the cabin. She slipped into the tunnel, pulling the hatch closed and latching it tight. Wyatt clung to her, whispering, "What do they want?" "The gold, the legend, control," she said. "But they're not taking us." She lit a lantern, revealing Eli crouched behind the tool rack. "Got here before the road iced over," he whispered. "Didn't want to risk the front door." Lena exhaled hard, then motioned to a crate near the back wall. "We move, through the old mine path. It comes out by the ravine. We can circle back around to the main road." They moved through the tunnels, ducking under low beams and stepping over ice-glazed stones. Behind them, above them, they heard bootsteps. Someone was inside the cabin. Silas had come prepared. They emerged from the mine shaft near dawn. The snow was deeper, and Lena's fingers ached with cold, but she didn't stop. The path led them to the edge of the hill where they could see the cabin in the distance. Dark, smoke trailing from the chimney, figures moving inside. "They're ransacking it," Eli said, "looking for the chest." Lena reached for the radio strapped to her belt. She'd hidden it earlier, worried Silas would jam their frequency. She clicked the mic. "Sheriff Morales, do you read?" Static. She turned to Wyatt. "Stay here, no matter what." He nodded, jaw tight. Lena and Eli made their way back down through the trees, circling behind the cabin. One of Silas's men stood guard at the back door. Lena waited, heart pounding, until he stepped away to check something by the woodpile. Then she and Eli slipped inside. The cabin was in chaos. Furniture overturned, books and maps scattered. The chest, the real one, was hidden beneath a false floorboard in the storage closet. Still untouched. Silas hadn't found it yet. Lena moved fast. She pulled out a small satchel and stuffed it with only 3 items: Boone's scroll, the medallion, and 1 gold coin. Then she pushed the floorboard back in place. Eli nodded toward the front room. Voices, footsteps. Silas was close. They moved toward the tunnel again when the front door slammed. Silas. He stood in the hall, rifle in hand, eyes furious. "You think you can run from a blood oath?" he growled. Lena raised her shotgun. "You already lost. There's nothing left to take." Silas stepped forward. Eli stepped in front of her. "This ends tonight," Eli said. A shot rang out. Silas staggered. Behind him, Sheriff Morales lowered her sidearm. "Sorry I'm late," she said. "Had to deal with the paperwork from his escape." Lena caught her breath. Silas groaned and collapsed. Morales cuffed him, this time tighter, colder. "You okay?" she asked. Lena nodded. "Now, can I call this in?" Morales smirked. Lena laughed, though it came out like a sob. "Please do." That night, they burned the broken chairs for heat. Wyatt curled up by the hearth, exhausted. Morales stayed until morning. No more torches. No more Boone. But Lena knew something else would come. The storm had passed, but the legacy remained, and the past never really stayed buried. Lena had barely slept when the black SUVs rolled up the mountain road the next morning. Their matte paint and tinted windows didn't belong here, not among the frost-bitten apple trees and smoke-stained chimney tops of the Appalachian backwoods. The feds had arrived, and with them came the weight of a different kind of storm. By the time she stepped onto the porch, Morales was already standing between her and the agents, badge visible and jaw set. "This is Cartwright's land," Morales said coolly. "You're here by courtesy, not jurisdiction." The man in the lead, mid-40s, buzz cut, a face like concrete, flashed his badge anyway. "Special Agent Travis Milner, Department of Homeland Security. We're investigating the potential recovery of Confederate-era contraband linked to domestic extremism." "You mean the chest?" Lena asked, voice even. Milner's eyes flicked to her. "I mean the implications. We understand you've unearthed materials belonging to General Thaddeus Boone." Lena exchanged a glance with Morales. That's a heavy accusation for a single mother living in a half-frozen cabin, she said. Milner didn't flinch. Mind if we take a look around? Got a warrant? Morales asked. We will soon. The agent set up shop in the town hall, commandeering space like it had always been theirs. Files spread across tables, digital scanners plugged into century-old outlets. Lena was asked to come in for questioning that afternoon. Morales drove her. Just tell them what they need to know, the sheriff said. But not everything. Lena gave her a side eye. Is that legal advice or hometown loyalty? Little of both. The interrogation room smelled like varnish and paper. Lena sat straight, hands on the table. Milner flipped open a file thick with photos, images of the gold, the medallion, the ciphered scroll, even a blurry frame of Silas Boone cuffed in the snow. How long have you known about the treasure? He asked. I didn't come looking for it. It came looking for me. And the Confederate insignia? You aware possession of stolen wartime property crosses into federal offense territory? Lena met his eyes. I didn't steal anything. I inherited a story. Milner leaned back. Did you tell anyone else about it? Media? Bloggers? Archivists? Only people I trust. That a yes? It's a none of your business. Back at the cabin, Wyatt waited with Eli. The boy had been quiet since the siege. He held the Boone medallion like it might vanish if he blinked. They're going to take it all, he whispered. Eli rested a hand on his shoulder. Maybe, but maybe they won't know where to look. He opened a hollowed-out book from the library shelf, a false spine, pages carved out. Inside, the scroll and one of the coins. Some things are too heavy to hand over to strangers, Eli said, especially if they don't know the weight of history. Meanwhile, Morales sat in her cruiser outside the courthouse. The wind tapped against her window like a persistent ghost. She reached into her glove box, pulled out a small velvet pouch. 1 gold coin. She stared at it for a long time before tucking it beneath the seat. The next day, Eli met with Professor Madeline Brack, a Civil War historian from the University of North Carolina. She arrived wearing boots dusted with red clay and eyes that saw through pleasantries. You're telling me you found original Confederate orders, untouched? Not just orders, Eli replied. A doctrine. Boone's plan for an uprising that never happened. A manifesto soaked in legacy. And you're not handing it over to the Smithsonian? We'll donate it, he said, under one condition. The land stays protected. The cabin stays untouched. Brack considered. You've got yourself a provisional deal. We'll file it under historical sanctuary. At dusk, Lena and Wyatt sat on the porch steps. Snow had melted down to patches of slush. The wind felt more like spring. They'll come back, won't they? Wyatt asked. Maybe, Lena said, but next time, we'll be ready. Down the driveway, Dorr stood beside his silver pickup. He didn't approach, just watched, eyes narrowed. Then he climbed in and drove off. Lena didn't wave. Wyatt asked, Think he'll try again? She nodded, but he's not the only one with roots in this land. That night, Lena buried something beneath the hearth, a small wooden box with a single coin, a folded page of Boone's writing, and the first letter from her mysterious great-aunt that had started it all. She carved 2 words into the lid, remember wisely, and finally, she slept. The morning fog clung to the holler like a held breath, curling low around the pines and seeping into the corners of the cabin. But inside, something had shifted. The walls no longer echoed loneliness. The silence wasn't empty. It was expectant. Lena rolled up her sleeves and pried open the last box of salvaged hardware. Her hands ached from days of labor, but it was a good ache, an earned one. The cabin, once a crumbling relic of mystery and mourning, was being reborn with each nail, each board, each hand that touched it. Neighbors had shown up unannounced, some with lumber, some with pie, a few with nothing but sweat to give. Nobody spoke about the gold. They didn't need to. The town had chosen not to gossip, not out of fear, but out of something rarer, respect. Wyatt ran out of the cabin with an armful of hand-drawn posters. He'd titled them Boone's Folly, a history lesson, in bold marker. Lena laughed softly. You're really making an exhibit, huh? It's not just an exhibit, he said proudly. It's a story. People should know what happened, but the right version, not the one on TV. He tacked the first paper beside the entryway, crooked and full of confidence. A boy becoming a historian, not with degrees, but with memory. Eli, leaning on a walking stick after slipping during the last snowmelt, stepped up beside Lena. He's got your spine, you know, the good kind. He's got his father's clarity too, Lena said. That mix, it's dangerous in the best way. The museum space took shape in what had once been the storage room, bare beams, wide floorboards, and now curated chaos. Boone's coded journal pages were framed behind old glass panes Eli had pulled from the church attic. Wyatt labeled each artifact meticulously: rusted bayonet, found behind root cellar, 1865, Confederate officer's medallion, do not touch. Morales helped source vintage shelving from the town archive, and even Dora's estranged cousin donated a hand-carved bench. It had belonged to their grandmother, the only Boone descendant who'd stayed in town and kept her head down. The sheriff arrived one afternoon with a gift, a steel lockbox filled with Civil War-era books, many signed by obscure captains and forgotten privates. She didn't say where it came from. Don't ask, she told Lena. Just make it count. Lena nodded, grateful. As spring edged in, wildflowers began pushing through the soil near the old cellar. Lena left them untouched. She marked the place not with a sign, but with a silence, a respect. The treasure had been buried again, by choice this time, not shame. She blogged the journey, gold beneath our feet. It wasn't flashy, no sponsors, just raw entries, reflections, and scanned sketches from Wyatt's notebooks. One post, titled "A Cabin That Watched History," went mildly viral in Appalachian circles. Comments poured in. My great-granddaddy told stories about Boone. Never thought they were true. This is why place matters. This is why stories matter. You're raising that boy, right? The praise made her uneasy. Fame had never been the goal, but it did something else. It reminded her the story no longer belonged only to the past. It was living now. It breathed through every cracked window and footstep on the porch. That week, Eli stood in front of a class of college students from the University of North Carolina. Professor Brack had arranged a field trip, a pilot program in local oral history. The students huddled around the hearth, notebooks open, phones recording. Eli began. This place ain't about gold. It's about what we bury and what we choose to remember. Not every treasure shines. Some weigh more than they're worth. But if you're lucky, you find the story that holds it together. Lena listened from the kitchen, heart full. Later, Morales stopped by with homemade peach cobbler. She leaned against the porch post as Wyatt ran past, chasing a squirrel with a cardboard camera rig strapped to his shoulder. You did it, the sheriff said. Lena shook her head. Number we did, and we're not done. They clinked coffee mugs in the soft light of late afternoon. Behind them, the rebuilt roof gleamed under the sun, and inside, a laminated map pointed to Boone's Tunnel with a note, "Please don't fall in." That night, Lena opened a drawer in the cabin's desk. Inside sat Boone's final orders, now laminated and folded in acid-free paper. She added a note of her own. History is not for hiding. It's for choosing what not to repeat. She placed it back inside, shut the drawer, and locked it with the old key Silas once tried to steal. Outside, a breeze danced with the wind chimes Morales had hung 2 summers ago. They sang low, like memory, and the cabin stood, not as a relic, but as a keeper. It began with a camera crew. They arrived early one fog-wrapped morning in a dented white van with network decals on the side and license plates from D.C. The kind of crew that called ahead, asked polite questions, then showed up regardless of the answer. Lena stood on the porch with a dish towel over one shoulder and a lukewarm cup of coffee in hand as the reporter stepped out in heels that immediately sank into the soft earth. A cameraman followed, lugging equipment with the casual indifference of someone who had filmed everything from wildfires to celebrity breakups. Ms. Cartwright, Emily Voss, Channel 8 National, we've come to document your story, the Confederate gold, the siege, the mystery. Lena didn't move. I didn't invite you. We're hoping you'll reconsider. This is history. The world wants to know. Behind Lena, Wyatt peered out from behind the screen door, already clutching his sketchbook protectively. Lena took a long sip, then said evenly, "The cabin doesn't belong to cameras." Voss blinked, thrown off script. "Excuse me?" "It belongs to the people who lived here, who died here, and who carried the weight of what was left behind. That's not your story. Not your right." She turned back inside without another word. The van was gone by noon. Later that week, the mail arrived heavier than usual. A manila envelope, yellowed and sealed with wax. Not something from the regular post office. No return address, no stamp. Just the name, Lena Cartwright. She opened it at the kitchen table while Wyatt organized his drawings for the next school group tour. Inside was a faded union badge, brittle with age, and a handwritten note on crackling parchment. "You weren't the first to find it, just the first to respect it. E." Lena stared at it for a long while. The handwriting was elegant but aged, familiar somehow. She held the badge in her palm, cool and dented at the edges, imagining whose chest it once rested against in the throes of a war that still echoed through pine and stone. "Mom?" Wyatt asked gently. "Yeah, baby." "What does it mean?" She tucked the badge back into the envelope. "It means some stories weren't meant for headlines." The next school group came from Asheville, kids buzzing with too much energy, phone cameras poised. But when they entered the cabin, the hush settled over them like fog. Wyatt led the tour, guiding them past the relics with a mix of pride and solemnity. "This map shows where the tunnel runs, but we don't go down there anymore," he explained. "It's not about finding gold. It's about finding out why someone buried it." Lena watched from the back, marveling at how her son's voice had grown steady, rooted, like the cabin itself. After the students left, Eli and Morales joined them on the porch. The sheriff brought cinnamon rolls, and Eli brought silence. It was the kind that didn't need filling. "Remember that old Boone ledger?" Eli finally said. "I gave a copy to the university. They're building a digital archive. Our history, our way." Morales nodded, pleased. No more stolen legacies. They sat until the sun dipped low. That evening, Lena walked the perimeter of the property, as was her habit now. She paused at the ridge where the mine entrance once yawned open. It had been sealed again, by choice. She bent down and placed a single flat stone where the entrance had been. On it, she had etched, "The past doesn't need to stay buried, only respected." Behind her, a hawk soared overhead. Its wings clipped the treetops, and for a moment, Lena imagined it carrying pieces of forgotten history into the sky. Not to be hidden, but to be let go. When she returned inside, Wyatt was curled up reading a worn book about Civil War spies. He looked up and asked, "Mom, what if it happens again?" She didn't hesitate. "Then we'll be ready." That night, another envelope was slipped under the cabin door. This one had no name, just a hand-drawn sketch of a family on a porch, a boy holding a history book, and a woman smiling, backlit by the mountains. No note, just the drawing. Wyatt grinned. "Looks like us." Lena smiled, though her eyes welled. Maybe that's the story someone really wanted to tell. The days no longer rolled by like burdens. Now they hummed, soft and full. Lena stood barefoot in the garden behind the cabin, her hands deep in the cool spring soil. The last frost had finally passed. Tomato sprouts, basil, and marigolds pushed skyward like they'd been waiting on her permission. She turned over a clump of dirt, wiped her hands on her jeans, and looked up to see Wyatt on the porch, swinging his legs and reading a library book titled Ghosts of Gettysburg. He waved. She waved back. For the first time in a long while, the land didn't feel like something she had to brace against. It felt like it had accepted her, maybe even welcomed her. She sold the apartment in Charlotte last month. It was easier than she thought. The city hadn't felt like home in years, not since Paul died, not since every sidewalk reminded her of bills and traffic and shift changes. The money from the sale helped install a new solar unit and repair the well. They didn't need much more than that. Now, the cabin was their permanent home. Eli came by every other day, sometimes with a chapter draft for his historical memoir, sometimes just to sit in silence on the porch. His limp had eased, though he still leaned on the cane more out of habit than necessity. Sheriff Morales stopped in with leftovers from her sister's wedding: cornbread, venison stew, and a container of peach moonshine sealed with wax. She stayed for coffee and didn't ask a single question about the news vans parked in the next town over. "They'll get bored," she said, sipping. "Your story's too honest for them." Lena smiled. "That's the plan." Wyatt had started giving weekly tours on Saturdays. No fee, just sign your name in the logbook. Tourists came in polite trickles. Veterans, local teachers, a group of women from a book club in Nashville. He guided them room to room, past the framed cipher letters, the dug-up artifacts, the sealed tunnel door. "History isn't just about who won," he'd tell them. "It's about what we let survive." Lena watched him grow into himself more with each story he shared. His voice clearer, his posture taller. Sometimes she caught a flicker of Paul in the way he moved, his father's steadiness, his warmth. One afternoon, a group of students from Duke arrived. They interviewed both Lena and Wyatt for a digital oral history project. The students asked big questions about legacy, land, trauma. Wyatt answered with facts. Lena answered with heart. When asked what the cabin meant to her now, Lena paused. "It's where I stopped surviving and started living. It's not just a building. It's a promise we kept." Eli donated a small wooden donation box to the exhibit. Wyatt carved the words on it himself, "In case of greed." People smiled when they saw it. Some chuckled. Others dropped folded bills inside without a word. By late spring, they'd fenced off the wildflower patch near the old cellar. Lena let it grow wild, untamed, bright. She planted no markers, no signs, just let the petals bloom where blood and gold had once shared the soil. At the local middle school, Wyatt gave a talk about Boone. He didn't mention the treasure, just the truth. The letters, the regret, the weight of unspoken things passed down through generations. When a girl in the front row asked, "So, was your mom a hero?" Wyatt looked at her, then at the window beyond. "She's just my mom, and that's enough." That night, as the stars came out one by one over the Blue Ridge, Lena stood on the porch with a mug of chamomile and listened to the quiet. No hum of traffic, no flicker of worry, just the sound of cicadas and the distant hoot of an owl. Wyatt joined her, dragging a blanket across his shoulders. "Think anyone else will find what we did?" Lena smiled. "I think if they do, they'll know what to do with it now." He held up a small wooden box he'd made in shop class. Burned into the lid were the same words she'd once carved years ago: "Remember wisely." They stood together in the dark, the wind carrying the scent of turned earth and honeysuckle. Overhead, a lone hawk circled once, then veered off toward the hills. And Lena thought, not for the first time, maybe this story had always belonged to someone like her, someone ordinary, someone underestimated, not a historian, not a treasure hunter, not a soldier, just the mother, still,